This is the Darshan Talks podcast. Regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. I am Major Hoffman. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com. Hey guys, I'm here with Darshan Kulkarni. My name's Major. In the previous two episodes, we discussed how to get people to your clinical trials, and today's episode, we're going to discuss how to minimize the clinical trial patient loss or how to keep them in your trial. And what that actually means is we're going over a list of strategies to foster community involvement, the complexity of the study, fear of the unknown, the ease of commuting, and reminders, which sounds similar to the previous two episodes, Darshan. How is this different?
Well, I think the key piece is a reminder and refocusing of our goals. In the first case, we were talking about how do you get people interested. The second goal is how do you keep people interested, and how do you convince them that dropping out is not in their goals and is not in the best interest of the study. So it's really a continuation, if you will, and a rediscussion in light of this conversation. So for example, when we're talking about strategies to foster community involvement, the first question to ask is, how do you actually engage with the community? The key piece is talk to them, interview people. Patient groups often have patient leaders. And this seems surprising to people because, we can only have key opinion leaders, and key opinion leaders in pharma are often these famous physicians. But patients have patients they trust. And those people are very important in that community. Talk to them. Maybe have a focus group. Find out from 4, 5, 6 people what is important to them. Why would patients in these studies be dropping out? Maybe actually instead of, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but instead of having patients come all the time to the site, maybe you want to have a couple of things where you go to the patient's home. And that would minimize the number of times patients go, you know what, I can't break away from everything and go get a blood draw. Do you really need the patient to come to the doctor's office for a blood draw? Could you send a nurse for that to their house, like a home infusion nurse of some kind, or home care nurse, if you will? Then, as we talked about before, remind people why they're there. So we spoke earlier about how you can use promotion and advertising to recruit patients, but it's important to remind these patients who are now part of your study why they're part of it. So maybe positive awareness about the clinical trials, about the impact these patients are having on patients like themselves and on research in general and on health. That's why in many cases, the money involved in these studies doesn't have a huge impact on the patients. In some cases it does, but in many cases it doesn't. The reason they participate is because they're very interested in helping people. And you want to acknowledge how important they are and how they're making a positive difference in healthcare. Like we mentioned before, maybe having a support group, having patients who are part of these studies have an opportunity to vent, have an opportunity to talk to someone. It may be as simple as therapists. It may be having other patients to talk to. And again, you've got to be careful, right? You've got to be careful that that you aren't allowing patients to destroy the blind. But there are ways to address that. Having the study actually look at the people that the patient surrounds themselves with. So that could be husbands, that could be partners, that could be wives, that could be the people they live with. And the idea would be these people play a major role in how the patients or the study subjects conduct their lives. And if you ignore them, that will have a dramatic effect on whether these patients can continue to participate. And then lastly, we spoke about this a little bit. It's also been supported in some clinical literature, having community nurses conduct weekly support meetings to help with the process and to help people who are part of these studies feel like A, they're part of something bigger, B, they aren't alone in what they're feeling, and C, having a person to talk to.
So this is great advice if the patient already has a community or a support network in place, but it might be difficult to foster community involvement if there's no community. Could or should one be created if one doesn't exist for the patients or test subjects?
So that's a great question. So the key piece is that if you don't provide that community, if you will, you're creating a vacuum, and patients will create their own community. And now you have no control over what happens in that community. And not that you want the control as much as you don't want the blind broken.
Right.
So it's important that you have a conversation, create a community for them to engage. And that community can also help with communicating the changes that are happening. Almost never, well, that's not fair. Studies routinely change. And patients need to understand what they signed up for and how what they signed up for is changing as you continue. Is there a new arm of the study? Is the study going to go from 14 blood draws to 17 blood draws? And why is that happening? Is there a change in goals? Each of those is going to have a massive, massive effect. So it's important that when you are communicating with patients who are already in your study, there is a way of interacting with the community, where you as a sponsor enable the medical community to say, you know what, my patient. So if you have a patient who has, say, diabetes, that patient may have other disease states as well. Maybe having a conversation, awareness campaign, saying that we're doing the study in your area. If you get patients with this study, just be aware that this is happening. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. So it's not just about that patient. It's creating a support network for that patient. Maybe educating patients in the clinical trials during routine outpatient visits. Mm-hmm. So these patients, that will not only help with recruitment, it will help with keeping those patients in. And then helping patients with informed consent, where other patients, again, if these patients have come into the study, having a person to talk to, having a person say, did you have this happen to you? Now, you may or may not be able to answer that question. However, they need an outlet to be able to say, this is how I feel. I feel weird. Is this normal? And maybe the physician or the PI is not the right person for them for that reason. Community nurses can be a huge piece and very important piece of figuring out and breaking down the complexity of these studies into manageable bites. And that's going to be a continuing use of patients, of caregivers, and enabling them to help people they care about.
So we've discussed what we're talking about is essentially how to minimize or how to keep your study from losing the patients that it acquires. We've discussed strategies to foster community involvement, which means interviews, focus groups, home visits, and so on, and how to address the complexity of the study. But similar to the previous two episodes where we discussed how to obtain or increase awareness for your clinical trial, how do we address the fear of the unknown of your trial in this phase of retaining your patients?
Great question, Major. So I think that what's important is recognizing that just because you started the study doesn't mean that you now know everything about the study. It only means you've started the study. You as the patient are now into the abyss. You are into the unknown. What would be useful is seeing that informed consent form, it's available to them on a consistent basis. They can review it as needed. It's the informed consent form is not just your legal document that you get to keep in your regulatory file saying, oh, I had someone sign an informed consent form. Mm-hmm. That informed consent form also helps with explaining and contextualizing to the patient what's happened to them. What may also be useful is, and again, giving them the ability to refer back to it as necessary. What also could be useful is using the newer technologies. Imagine using augmented reality or virtual reality to show a patient, to put them into a room where someone who was like them either benefited or didn't benefit, whether there were side effects or what happened to them as a result of of either being part of the study or just having specific side effects. For example, if someone says it causes tardive dyskinesia, well, that's great, but I don't know what that means. What are the physical impacts of that? What actually happens? Having another patient virtually talk to them and showing them what happens to them. So having a recorded patient on a AR screen or a VR screen explain, here are the side effects I had. Here is what my process has been. Maybe interviewing those patients and showing and highlighting the role these patients have played, obviously with appropriate consent. But enabling those patients to participate and highlighting the massive role that these patients play, not only in recruiting, but in maintaining and explaining explaining the side effects that might happen, the study procedures that might happen, and again, helping with informed consent.
So in order to address the fear of the unknown, where just because you started the study doesn't mean that you know all about the study, it just means you started the study, and there's still going to be ongoing concerns that happen. Maybe a side effect that was definitely mentioned, was definitely discussed, and the patient or subject understood and signed the consent form, but now they're starting to have concerns about this. It's important to address it in a more empathetic way, and that can be done through a variety of means, depending on what you have available or what your resources are. Of course, you can use augmented reality or virtual reality to show side effects, to discuss those, to allow patients or subjects to connect with those who have experienced those in the past, just to kind of help with their confidence in their path. What else? So I guess we still have to discuss ease of commuting and the reminders. Is there anything else about the fear of the unknown, though, that we need to discuss?
I think maybe we should talk a little bit about that in the next podcast.
Well, hey, there you go. Thank you for listening to the Darshan Talks podcast, Regulatory Guy, Irregular Podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. I am Major Hoffman. If you have any questions for Darshan, reach out via Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.